Hey there, listener. Corey Andrew Powell here, and I'm excited to share that Motivational Mondays is now sponsored by BetterHelp. Feeling stressed or anxious? Well, BetterHelp brings you online therapy that's convenient and affordable. NSLS members get 50% off your first month of BetterHelp when you sign up at betterhelp.com/NSLS or click the link in the show notes. Start your journey to better mental health today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Motivational Mondays. I am Corey Andrew Powell, your host, and today we have the privilege of hosting a true authority in the realm of leadership, Willie Pietersen. As a former CEO of multi-billion-dollar businesses and a distinguished professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business, Willie has dedicated his career to understanding what it takes to lead effectively. His insights have shaped organizations like American Express, Johnson & Johnson, ExxonMobil, and even the Girl Scouts of America. Today, he joins us to discuss his upcoming book, Leadership: The Inside Story, time-tested prescriptions for those who seek to lead. It comes out September 24. I'm happy to have a little advanced copy here. Willie, welcome to Motivational Mondays.
Many thanks, Corey. Nice to be with you.
Thank you, sir. It's so great to have you here as well. Of course, we're a leadership podcast, and so we love to talk about leadership, and you've got a lot of wonderful insights to share. So I want to just begin with your new book, obviously. The book title, as I mentioned, is called Leadership: The Inside Story. So what inspired you to write this book, and what do you hope readers take away from it?
Yeah, well, I've been, as you've just said, my life has been a learning laboratory in many ways of effective leadership. Started growing up in South Africa during the apartheid era, seeing all of those issues. And as a young person, you suffer from mental imprinting that whatever is around you and reinforced by the authority figures you believe to be the way the world works. I grew up in that setting, and then gradually, as I went through life, began to look back on it, left South Africa, began to understand how dysfunctional that system was, and became a great admirer of Nelson Mandela as a towering figure of leadership and as a role model. And I learned a lot from studying his life and thinking about leadership. And as I did that, and I went through my own career, 20 years as a CEO, as you've mentioned, teaching leadership and strategy now at Columbia Business School for 26 years, having the opportunity to work with a multiple number of corporate executives, consulting to many major corporations, has given me a wonderful kaleidoscopic view of leadership, the ability to study and understand different leadership styles, successes and failures. And I began to realize that leadership is like any other endeavor. If you want to do it really well, you need to understand what it is. It's not just a random process of exercising power or making great, bold decisions on an ad hoc basis. It's a deliberate, intentional philosophy based on a set of principles. And that's why I call it the inside story. Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman philosopher and emperor, called this our internal command center. And I began to realize that fundamentally leadership begins with that kind of set of operating principles that we internalize, that guide our actions and inspire others. And we need to be very clear about our command center. Now, that's a lifelong learning process. Again, I quote somebody, Voltaire, who said, you've got to cultivate your own garden. You have to learn as you go and as the environment shifts. But every single successful leader that I've observed has had an internal command center that is understood and acted on with great clarity. So with that kind of understanding that there is a structure, there is a skill, if you like, and it's a philosophical approach to what it is that you act upon, so it's not just an abstract philosophy. I developed a framework for leaders to think about how they develop their own command center.
Mm-hmm.
And that framework has got 3 domains attached to it. And they are overlapping as a kind of a Venn diagram, 3 circles.
Yeah.
So the first domain is leadership of self. That's where it all begins. That's the threshold requirement. Deep personal knowledge, a clear set of principles that guide our actions and inspire others. Second domain is strategic leadership, the ability to provide a clear direction for the organization you seek to lead, supported by a set of key priorities that unify the organization behind the central idea of success in their particular environment. And the third domain is interpersonal leadership, bringing out the best in others. These need to be mutually supportive of each other, just like an ecosystem, but it provides a way for us to think about leadership in a systematic way and understand, if we want to learn about leadership, that we can go back to this model, this structure, and say, as I develop my own leadership skills in a changing environment, and I look at my successes and failures, I can go back to this simple model and say, where do I need to grow most? Where do I need to put the main pressure to succeed even better than I'm doing now? Is it in the domain of personal leadership? Is it in the domain of strategic leadership? Or is it in interpersonal leadership? Where am I falling short? Where do I need to close gaps to succeed more effectively? So that's, I guess, my starting point is to have a structure for thinking about leadership and to understand that it's not just about power. Leadership is essentially about service, not about power.
That is so wonderful. And there is so much to unpack there. One of the most important things, though, I think, and there's quite a lot there that is important, but you do raise an interesting point that I always stress, and we always must stress with leadership. It's not about being the strong arm in the room or the person who's declaring themselves to be the smartest, and many oftentimes that a strong leader realizes that they may not be the smartest person in the room, but they know how to also then invite people who know things that they don't know and to invite them in to help them be stronger. But you talk about the empowerment of others. And so often that part is overlooked. Leadership, a big part of it is empowering others to actually also lead as well and to discover their own talent and ability. So do you think that out of those 3 things you mentioned in the diagram, is there one that you think stands out? Because I think that one is the one that's most overlooked.
Well, it's interesting because it connects very strongly to personal leadership. At the end of the day, if we think about it, leadership is about character and competence. You need to have the competence, the domain understanding and expertise to lead the organization that you're leading. Understand its external environment, understand its people and its challenges. But that alone is not enough. It's character at the end of the day that works together with competence to create the energy that drives an organization. So that comes back to our internal command center, but gives us this kind of, if I call it, permission to lead. Now, that's the enabler at the end of the day to unlock the best in others, to inspire them. Now, again, we need to think about, how does that work? Do we just go along to people and say, I want you to be inspired? Do we just go along to them and say, I've got a great idea for success. I want you to participate in this with great enthusiasm. Well, you might as well just call it in or just write an email and ask people to be inspired and enthused. It doesn't work that way. And now what I have found is that the best way to engage people is to involve them in the decisions that need to be made, is to get them to participate in thinking about the future of the organization and how to create a strategy, to have a structure to do that, to invite diversity of thought. When you involve people and ask them for their point of view and sincerely listen to them, you're showing that you value them. And you're creating a shared commitment to a successful future. Now, then you get an interesting juncture, because diversity of thought of that kind produces the best ideas. So back to what you said, Corey, it's not telling people what the best ideas are. It's asking them to participate in the discovery of the best ideas. And we need a technique to do that. So diversity of thought produces that, and then has that issue of engagement. Now, when the decision gets made ultimately on what to do, you've got to shift in gear to go from diverse thinking to convergent action, to unity of action. Now, by definition, not everybody's going to agree with the decision that got made, because you've invited diversity of thought. Mm-hmm. But what you can do then is to thank everybody for their points of view, even though there might have been some conflicts of ideas, and to say, that's improved the quality of what we've decided to do. Thank you for your input. And there's a little formula I think we can provide to make that shift of gear successful. And that is to say, being on board is how we behave after the decision has been made. Before the decision has been made, I want all the diversity of thought. I want all the best ideas on the table. And, at meetings when I'm listening to ideas, big issue is this: who speaks first? Do we, as a leader, begin to say, well, here are my thoughts, tell me what you think? Now, the trouble with this is people look at you as an authority figure. Mm. Everything you do is symbolic. And what you say sounds almost like a piece of legislation, right? And people are a little bit reluctant to argue against, what you put up as if you like, the straw man, and say, knock this one down. It's much better to say, here's the issue we're confronted with. I want the best ideas. I want to listen first. And then let's pull our ideas together. So yeah. What are these type of techniques? As I think about ultimate inspiration and motivation, it's the opportunity for human beings to dedicate themselves to a cause larger than themselves, combined with the opportunity to make a difference to the outcome. I think that's the way we need to lead organizations.
When you speak about that in the realm of diversity and diversity of thought, of course, my mind goes to the idea of diversity of people as well, because you then need to bring in, or not need to bring in, you would most likely have people of varying backgrounds and varying walks of life as part of your organization, many of whom may not have felt that they've been invited into the conversation proactively to have that kind of collective result. So when you mention that, I do think about your upbringing in South Africa. I'm old enough to remember the whole apartheid thing as a kid, because it was tied to a performance casino called Sun City, and I was a big music kid. So I remember that like it was yesterday. But I do wonder for you, you said when you left South Africa, that's sort of when your worldview changes. So what was that like to kind of have a realization that, wow, the whole world that I thought I knew based on what I was being told sort of governmentally is different. And there's a whole other realm of how people think out there that I need to embrace.
That's a really interesting question, Corey, of, if you like, how the way we evolve our thinking. And we've got to be willing, of course, to accept and consider alternative ideas. Now, as a 5 or 6 year old, we're not equipped to do that. We want safety in our surroundings, and we're told this is the way the world works, and we follow those precepts and principles without really questioning them. Mm-hmm. So my learning had a number of growth stages that are very specific. The first is going to my local university in South Africa, where I studied law. Now, for the first time, I was in contact with conflicting ideas, people who are challenging the status quo and saying there's something wrong with this. And I would say, well, what's wrong with it? Everybody's been given a separate but equal opportunity. And then they said, let's see how that's working in practice, because that's a slogan. How is it working in practice? What is fair about what's happening now? Is everybody being given an equal opportunity at the end of the day to participate in the development of this wonderful country that's been bequeathed to us? Yes or no? Citing evidence, going to and fro. Began that way to question my own underlying assumptions of what's true. I'm a great follower of philosophy. We seek wisdom. When wisdom is the answer to three questions. The first question is, what's true and what's not true? The second question is, amongst all the things that are true, what's important amongst all of those things, and what's less important? And the third thing is, how will we act? How will we act on the beliefs that we develop that way? So it's philosophy in action. Now, that began a set of questioning. Then I was lucky enough to win a Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford in England. I'd never been outside my home country. It's at the southern tip of Africa, a remote place, and the whole wide world was there, and I'd not discovered it and was intrigued by it. And now I was really introduced to again, I use the word kaleidoscope of ideas from people from many, many different countries who were looking from the outside in at what was happening in South Africa, some of them very well informed. It invited me to do this leap in my own understanding, was the ability to look at something from the outside in and truly understand it that way. What they say is the last thing a fish notices is the water that it's swimming in. Now, you have to get outside of your environment mentally. Even, that was physically, I got outside of it, involved in a lot of debates with people from many countries, and had a shift that was somewhat profound in my thinking. Realizing that what was happening was wrong, unjust, and cruel, and knew in my bones that something needed to happen to change it. Otherwise, there was going to be the prospect of a violent revolution.
Yeah.
So that was an epiphany, and a realization that, the beliefs that I'd started with had evolved to an understanding based on this kind of more objective way of evaluating things and opening my mind more deliberately. There was discomfort. There always is. When the anchor is pulled up from what your original beliefs were, it's a very uncomfortable situation. But that's how real learning happens. Margaret Wheatley likes to say that you cannot change a living thing from the outside. You can only disturb it so that it changes itself. And these were the disturbances that enabled me to change myself in terms of the way I thought. And Mandela had the same experience. I went back and practiced law, and in Cape Town, in South Africa. That's what I'd been trained to do. And there was a process to classify people according to their race, because there was complete separation. It was called apartheid. That's the pronunciation of it, apartheid. The word hate, of course, sounds like, what it is. Apartness is what it means in Afrikaans. And when there was ambiguity, you were not allowed to go to the same school. You were not allowed to live in the same area. You were not allowed to marry people of a different race. You were not allowed to have sexual relationships with people of a different race, believe it or not. And there was this board called the Race Classification Board that heard cases of ambiguity. And people would show up, with their representative lawyer or whatever it is, and examined like laboratory specimens, put a pencil to their hair to see its kinkiness, look at the color of their skin, something closely. And I happen to represent a number of clients whose lives have been torn apart. Kids in the same family. You two belong in that white school. You two seem to have a colored kind of element, and you go to the other school. And then looking at the parents and say, your marriage is illegal because you're from different races. You've got to separate. You can't live. You can't cohabit. I mean, it's hard to.
This is fascinating.
Something like this, you say, can that really be true? Well, it was. So I represented these people. And what I saw brought home something to me. Now, I'd been at Oxford, I'd changed my view. But, we generalize. We talk about being unfair to people of color. Well, it's not people, it's individuals. And now for the first time, I saw the crushing effect this had on individual human beings. So getting away from groupthink and thinking about, the people involved, that was to me horrifying. Now, I'll just end this story quickly by telling you how it planned out for the clients I had. There was only one appeal from the findings of the Race Classification Board. That was to the Minister of the Interior. And you couldn't appeal to a court. Just the Minister of the Interior had final say and said, I support that finding and I overrule this one. I happen to know the leader of the opposition party, and I belong to that party, anti-apartheid party. I asked for a meeting. I said, could I just have an hour of your time? I was granted that meeting. I said, here are 5 files of these claimants, these victims of this examination. And I'd like you to have a look at them. Do you have a good relationship with the Minister of the Interior, of course, who was a member of the governing party, the National Party? He said, I know him well. Yes, we have totally different worldviews, but I know him well. I said, well, can you call in a favor, do you think? He said, I might be able to. Let me look at these files. A week later, he called me up and he said, I've managed to get the Minister of the Interior to overrule all these cases. I tell these families that they were going to be okay. But I was just lucky. I happened to know people in power. The system itself wouldn't have provided that kind of justice to people. I literally, that evening, had a discussion with my wife and said, we cannot continue to live here and raise a family in this environment. We need to get to another place. I really had the aspiration to come to the United States, but I was a lawyer with the local qualifications in South Africa. So I applied for a job with Unilever, a global company, in the hope of an international career. That would be my exit route, right? It was really rather amusing. I had my interview with the head of HR at the time, a guy called Peter Murray. And he said, oh, well, you're a lawyer. Do you want to join the legal department? I said, no. I want to join the marketing department. He said,
fun stuff.
Marketing? I said, I've read 19 books. I gave him the title. I said, well, that's what I know. I said, that's in books, but I'm an eager learner. Try me out. And he said, well, what are your real aspirations in Unilever? He said, I said, I'd love an international career. And he looked at me and he said, Willie, Unilever is not a travel agency. I said, okay, I understand. I apologize. I'm just being absolutely honest and transparent. It'll all be on the merits. Give me a chance. Let me prove what I can do. And let me see what happens. As it happened, I got very lucky and I got transferred and promoted to wonderful roles within Unilever in the UK, in Australia, in Holland, and then ultimately here in the USA. And we became citizens here. So that was a wonderful career experience with Unilever, internationally, learning about leadership, becoming progressively more senior in their system, and a way to get out of South Africa. So I watched the whole phenomenon of a peaceful transfer of power from my home in Connecticut in the United States with literally tears in my eyes of disbelief, wonderment, and joy to see what was possible under a leader like Mandela.
Mm.
And honestly, I would tell you, Corey, if you saw the raw details that I saw, the anger and the resentment that caused, I thought a peaceful transfer of power was impossible. And Mandela pulled it off. The most majestic example that I've ever experienced in my lifetime of great leadership.
Hmm. You know, this is one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had on the show. Again, because I have a reference for it in my lifetime and watching the civil unrest in the early 80s, I guess it was, when I began to notice what was happening. And it seemed very foreign for me as a little Black kid in America who, as far as I knew, was in a very integrated country, and we had moved beyond that kind of stuff. But when I look at it actually time wise of when it was happening, America was not that far behind from the Civil Rights Act, from what was still, those time periods are really, really close. So, you putting that in perspective for me, the fact that all those legalities were in place of separation. I mean, from the point of you couldn't even have friends or, or sexual relations or, and then the ambiguity of like the children within one family, like that is mind blowing. One child might look more white presenting. So they would actually legislate for them to go to one school and the blacker, darker kid would go. Like that's mind boggling to me. But America was not that different just years prior, which is interesting.
I realized that when I began to, read about American history and see about the transition that got made and realize that these things are not a single event that happen on a particular day. They are a journey. And that journey is pursued with determination and courage by leaders. And, Martin Luther King, for example, was a phenomenal example of this. I think, Lyndon Johnson did a great deal at the end of the day. But he was persuaded to do it. I don't think he just said one day, got out of bed and said, well, this is all wrong. I'm going to try and fix it with
right. No.
I don't think it happened that way. Mm-hmm. And the power of, moral persuasion by somebody like Martin Luther King and others that were involved in that movement. Always change leadership is involving setbacks, disappointments, discouragement. And, as the Japanese like to say, fall down 6 times, get up 7. And I think that's what that kind of leadership was about. Mm-hmm. A sustained effort and passing the baton to subsequent leaders to say, this is not just my idea. It's a movement based on justice. And somebody has to carry it forward like a relay race. And so it went progressively. And, but we're not there yet. There's no there. It's a journey. And it never stops. I always think about these things as kind of pushing a lever. And the moment you take your hands off that lever, it just goes back by itself to where it was. You can never take the pressure off. Now, I think there'll come a day where people will literally come to the realization that race is irrelevant. We're not there yet.
No, far from it in some aspects, I would say. Or some people are more, progressive than others. But when you mention that, though, it is fascinating to think that we have really not realized that we as a human race have actually been stunted greatly, a great disservice done to ourselves by deeming people not valuable because of genetics or melanin or a lack of melanin or all the sort of physiological things that happen that have nothing to do with ability. And at the end of the day, I say who's the big loser in all of it is all of us. We're the losers.
You're right. It diminishes all of us. Mm-hmm. It's based on a set of human biases. And the truth of the matter is nobody is completely objective and unbiased. We're all impulses. We're born with them. And the big task, I think, for us is awareness of our biases. confirmation bias, status quo bias, denial, and all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And wired into us is a bias that makes us suspicious of somebody who doesn't look like us, speak like us, and act like us. That kind of a primordial bias. And, maybe it was true in caveman days, right? When, people were competing for food, literally going out and kind of fighting over it and all that sort of and saying, oh, here are people who look different. They might be a threat to me. Now, I think just uncovering that within ourselves and saying, I want to make myself aware of the biases that drive my attitudes and behaviors. And once you begin to realize that, you begin to critique it and say, I know it's a kind of a raw impulse, but is it just? Is it correct? Does it respect the basic dignity of human beings, regardless of where they're from or what they look like? Can we build a better world by dwelling in that kind of way because it's divisive, based on suspicion and sometimes even hatred? And, those are the big questions. And if you answer no, we can't build a better world. And it's back to bringing out the best in others. When we bring out the best in others, everybody benefits. So it's that challenge, it's back to imprinting for me as a kind of what I've learned of, these things get embedded and they become unquestioned. We have to question our own assumptions and think about our own framework of leadership. What are our guiding principles? Do we want that to be a guiding principle, the way we lead our lives and make other people better than they would have been without us? I mean, why are we here? We're here really for others. I love these African proverbs. I laid them out in my book.
Yes.
Because none of them is in a library or written down. The ancient Greeks and, the Asian ancient sages, etc., all of their Sun Tzu and all of these people, and Confucius, all these things are written down. These are word of mouth, but they are just as profound. And, one of them that I love, and Bishop Desmond Tutu used to quote it a lot, Archbishop of Cape Town. And he used to say, I am because you are. We all help each other become better human beings. So I think it's a way of saying, I've got certain things imprinted on my mind. I need to step back and think about them and challenge them according to my norms and principles of justice and fairness. I think fairness is the governing principle for democracy, for interacting with human beings, for creating a political system that is beneficial to all. And so that's just the way I've begun to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Your adoration for Proverbs, it's so, I completely understand it now too, because one of my favorite parts of your book is when you talk about respect for the elders.
Yeah.
It's a big one because, you're basically in this aspect doing that with quoting people like Mandela. We're talking about the teachings of Dr. King and the actions he put forth, Bishop Tutu as well. And it resonates with me because I had a situation with my grandfather he passed away like 2 years ago now at his 90s, but he was born in 1929. And we were talking about 3 years ago about his grandkids and some of them who've done really, really well in their careers in scientific fields and engineering. And they were discussing like the homes they were buying, the grandkids and their salaries. And my grandfather was so taken aback by like the money that he heard his own grandchildren being able to afford in today's world. And he said, I can't believe you kids live like that. I mean, you know how long I would have had to work on a farm to make that kind of money? I would have never done it. And we reminded him that the only reason why any of your grandkids do that is because you worked on the farm. and to make sure that your son, who's their father, had a better life than you had. Therefore, he was able to now make sure his kids had a better life. Thus, they are engineers and doctors. And
Right.
he had to, I had to make sure he understood he was part of that legacy brought forward, and it made all the difference. Just that respect of the elder. So I just want to just thank you for that part of the book, because I had a personal story that resonated with me. So I just really appreciate that. So I want to make sure I tell you.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for mentioning that. Now, as
Yeah.
being an elder myself, um, I sometimes have to remind executives I work with at seminars and so on, is to say, listen, I'm old, but I don't know everything. We
Right.
have to learn together, right? I will tell you what I think. You must decide what you think. You must have agency over your own life. I'll
Mm.
tell you an interesting thing, though, on this issue of the biases that guide our thinking so often, that often they are hidden from us until we make them explicit through our thinking process. I think it creates self-doubt on the part of people who have a different color. Now, when I was running Seagram's USA business, we had 4 regional VPs that were very powerful in the organization, running particular regions of the USA. And an opening developed in one of the big regions, and there were 2 candidates. One candidate was a white man, the other candidate was a black man. And I had to make the decision. And everybody was watching. Everything you do is symbolic as a leader. It's what I call symbolic fallout to all your actions, even though you might not say anything, just your behavior does it. And it was a hard decision because they were both extremely capable people. The black man, in my opinion, was the better choice because of his interpersonal skills. He was a good business person, but his people loved him. Leadership is about people. So I chose him. And we had a meeting. He came to my office. He flew to New York, thanked me. We talked about his priorities. And he said, I'm really aware of the choice that you had to make and the symbolism. He said, did you choose me because I'm a black person and you wanted to create diversity? It's a sad question of self-doubt. And I said to him, no, I chose you because you are you. And everybody in this world is unique. Nobody else is like you. And I chose you for the unique contribution that you can make. Please believe in yourself. Now, that was kind of a notable meeting. Now, it was a bit preachy to say to somebody, believe in yourself. But I said it because self-doubt is corrosive. I didn't want him to go into his leadership role thinking, well, I hope they accept me because I was chosen as a black person to create diversity. And I had to really reassure him. Now, it ended up that he was an extraordinarily successful regional VP, arguably one of the best of the 4, and became a thought leader. They had quarterly meetings, the 4 of them, and I used to lead those meetings. And his voice was often the voice of wisdom and thoughtfulness. And it was a lovely thing to see.
That's incredible. And I think we have that whole conversation now happening a lot with diversity, and the sort of reversal of thought, that this idea that people who are being allowed in finally in executive decisions are just being allowed in because of skin color, like this sort of idea of like reverse racism, which I find to be completely, I don't discount concerns about that, but the idea is that there's always been equally as talented people, just not given the opportunity. So the effort is just to allow others to also have the opportunity, not just give them the opportunity because their skin is a certain color. But it's fascinating, again, that we're in that same place right now in 2024,
Yeah.
having those same kinds of conversations. So I appreciate your efforts, though, and what you've done in that realm. Those are visionary positions and visionary um, those are efforts to make the world a better place by making conscious decisions like that. So it's like you doing your part to balance that scale.
Yeah, I think we must all participate in this activity. Um, it is difficult to do because you want to create diversity. But if you appoint somebody who's not qualified for a role,
Hmm.
they set up to fail. That compounds the problem. And that's visible. So the way I like to think about it is you need to develop people, diverse groups of people, develop them actively so that they can realize their full potential and then make the appointments on the basis of merit.
Hmm.
And I think then you're doing the right thing. If you just wait and don't do anything to develop human beings as they grow in an organization, and then make appointments and say, well, this is a bit all male, all white, we better make a difference. That is not the healthiest situation. I mean, there need to be forcing mechanism. And I think the original forcing mechanism, this is the development of people and bringing them along and giving them self-confidence and the belief in themselves and doing it very, very deliberately on a diverse and broad basis in the organization. And you'll eventually develop a cadre of diverse leadership that way. But it has to be a systematic and deliberate process.
Excellent. Those are wonderful words of wisdom and inspiration. And I think it transpires into everyday life as well, not just in organizations. Just go through life that way and just kind of putting everyone on an equal playing field. And I think we'll be better off for it. So, Willie Pietersen, what an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Motivational Mondays. And the book, again, is called Leadership, The Inside Story, Time-Tested Prescriptions for Those Who Seek to Lead. And I wish you much success. And I really enjoyed it, so I recommend it. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Corey. Enjoy the conversation.